The first chapter of A Tale of Two Cities describes the period in which the text is written or is set. And so it's appropriate that the chapter is called The Period. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. In short, the period was so far like the present period that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on its being received, for good or for evil, in the superlative degree of comparison only. There were a king with a large jaw and a queen with a plain face on the throne of England. That's a reference to George III and Maria Sophia of Mecklenburg. Remember, George III is the king that the American colonies rebelled against. There were a king with a large jaw and a queen with a fair face on the throne of France. So that's Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. In both countries, it was clearer than crystal to the lords of the state preserves of loaves and fishes that things in general were settled forever. So nobody expected that there would be a revolution. It was the year of our Lord 1775, so it's 1775. Spiritual revelations were conceded to England at that favored period, as at this. Everyone was very superstitious. Mrs. Southcott had recently attained her 25th blessed birthday, of whom a prophetic private in the Life Guards had heralded the sublime appearance by announcing that arrangements were made for the swallowing up of London and Westminster. Even the Cock Lane ghost had been laid only a round dozen years after rapping out its messages, as the spirits of the very year last past, supernaturally deficient in originality, rapped out theirs. Mere messages of the earthly order of events had lately come to the English crown and people from a Congress of British subjects in America, which, strange to relate, have proved more important to the human race than any communications yet received through any of the chickens of the Cock Lane brood. In other words, people were more willing to believe superstitious people who were reading tarot cards and tea leaves and chicken scratches than they were to believe the ambassadors who came back from America saying, "We're about to have a revolution." France, less favored on the whole as to matters spiritual than her sister of the shield and trident, England, rolled with exceeding smoothness downhill, making paper money and spending it. France was bankrupt. Under the guidance of her Christian pastors, she entertained herself besides with such humane achievements as sentencing a youth to have his hands cut off, his tongue torn out with pincers, and his body burned alive because he had not kneeled down in the rain to do honor to a dirty procession of monks, which passed within his view at a distance of some 50 or 60 yards. It is likely enough that rooted in the woods of France and Norway there were growing trees when that sufferer was put to death, already marked by the woodman, fate, to come down and be sawn into boards to make a certain movable framework with a sack and a knife in it, terrible in history. The framework with the sack and a knife is the guillotine. It is likely enough that in the rough outhouses of some tillers of the heavy lands adjacent to Paris there were sheltered from the weather that very day rude carts bespattered with rustic mire, snuffed about by pigs and roosted in by poultry which the farmer, Death, had already set apart to be his tumbrils of the Revolution. But that woodman and that farmer, though they worked unceasingly, worked silently, and no one heard them as they went about with muffled tread. The rather, forasmuch as to entertain any suspicion that they were awake, was atheistical and traitorous. In England there was scarcely an amount of order and protection to justify much national boasting, Daring burglaries by armed men and highway robberies took place in the capital itself every night. Families were publicly cautioned not to go out of town without removing their furniture to upholsterers' warehouses for security. The highwayman in the dark was a city tradesman in the light, and being recognized and challenged by his fellow tradesmen, whom he stopped in his character of the captain, gallantly shot him through the head and rode away. The male was waylaid by 7 robbers, and the guard shot 3 dead and then got shot himself by the other 4, in consequence of the failure of his ammunition, after which the male was robbed in peace. That magnificent potentate, the Lord Mayor of London, was made to stand and deliver on Turnham Green by one highwayman, who despoiled the illustrious creature in sight of all his retinue. Prisoners in London jails fought battles with their turnkeys, and the majesty of the law fired blunderbusses in among them, loaded with rounds of shot and ball. Thieves sniffed off diamond crosses from the necks of the noble lords at court drawing rooms. Musketeers went into St. Giles's to search for contraband goods, and the mob fired on the musketeers, and the musketeers fired on the mob, and nobody thought any of these occurrences much out of the common way. In the midst of them, the hangman, ever busy and ever worse than useless, was in constant requisition, now stringing up long rows of miscellaneous criminals, now hanging a housebreaker on Saturday who had been taken on Tuesday, now burning people in the hand at Newgate by the dozen, and now burning pamphlets at the door of Westminster Hall. Today taking the life of an atrocious murderer, and tomorrow a wretched pilferer who had robbed a farmer's boy of 6pence. All these things, and 1,000 like them, came to pass in and close upon the dear old year 1775. Environed by them, while the woodman and the farmer worked unheeded, those 2 of the large jaw and those other 2 of the plain and fair faces trod with stir enough, and carried their divine rights with a high hand. Thus did the year 1775 conduct their greatnesses, and myriads of small creatures, the creatures of this chronicle among the rest, along the roads that lay before them.